Whenever polemicists want to take a swipe at Christianity or the Bible or the Christian tradition, it seems like passages from the Old Testament are a favorite focal point for easy target practice. Richard Dawkins, for example, has made accusing the God of the Old Testament a range of pretty loathsome adjectives, something of a trademark for himself when he calls God jealous and petty, unjust, bloodthirsty, racist, infanticidal, and a whole other range. It's quite the long litany, actually. And I have to admit that there have been times where I've been reading the Old Testament with a sphincter fully clenched because of how terrifying I imagine some of those interactions with God to be, especially if I insert myself into some of those stories. And I don't know about you, but it's certainly given me pause on such occasions to ask, how can this be the same God that Jesus called Father and that he reveals to us through his teachings and example? You might be tempted, like Marcion was in the early church, to think that they aren't the same God, that the God of the Old Testament is like a lesser being and the one that Jesus reveals is the supreme God of the universe. This is a really, really important topic, and one that it seems that apologists and theologians address very rarely, or if they do, it tends to be in very short measures. I remember it being an ongoing difficulty for me when I was first converting to Christianity, and that when I would go looking for answers to this question, I would find myself frustrated because I would find the responses to be excessively abbreviated, almost as if this is like a taboo topic that we want to avoid and move on to the topics we really like to discuss. But I don't think that that's a reflection of how significant this question is or how often it arises in the minds of those who contemplate it. It's obvious enough that we want to create a cohesive understanding of who God is and how he is represented and reveals himself through salvation history. The point of this exercise for a Christian is to bring the old into harmony with the new, to see how they can relate to each other in a cohesive way. And the obvious difficulty in this is that we see God apparently acting differently towards people, almost as if there are a different set of moral rules at one time than there are for another. For example, we see him installing capital punishment for sins in the Old Testament, but then issuing statements like, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," in the New. We see statements like an eye for an eye in the Old Testament, and then admonitions about loving your neighbor and even your enemies in the New. But if your only conclusion about that apparent disparity is that God is incoherent or it can't possibly be the same God, then I think you're missing an important principle, because the same person can act differently under different circumstances depending on what those circumstances require of that situation, and still be the same person and even morally consistent. For example, take someone who might be employed as a prison guard but is also a husband and a father, and at home in the role of dad he might be a gentle and patient mentor to his children, because that's what the situation calls for. But when he goes back to work, he might be a much more severe disciplinarian when he interacts with the inmates, because that's the only kind of approach that they respond to. And you might even imagine that if his kids saw the role and responsibility that he fulfilled at work, they might perceive his conduct to be unrecognizable to the man that they know in their domestic life. A person with the same consistent moral constitution can act one way towards one person and then an entirely different way towards another person, because that's what the character of the person they are interacting with requires of them. And this, I think, in large portions, is what the Bible is describing in the situation of the Old Testament as it contrasts with the New. In setting the context for all of these interactions that are portrayed in the Old Testament between God and humanity, the Bible explicitly says that humanity had become dramatically corrupted by its estrangement from God, stemming from the betrayal of the first humans, and that they were in a state of complete rebellion against God and the divine nature. These are people, after all, who, when God reintroduces himself to them, they have to have it explained to them that murder and theft were wrong and incompatible with God's vision for them and their society. So we might be shocked by some of the measures that God employs to enforce the teachings that he is trying to instill in them, but imagine a race of people who are seriously fallen, like inmates in a jail, or something even more severe like a corrupted race like the orcs in The Lord of the Rings. When we read those stories or watch those movies and we hear characters like Aragorn instructing his troops to take no prisoners in a battle against the orcs, we're not like, what about the Geneva Conventions? No, we're like, yeah, the only good orc is a dead orc. And I think that something of that attitude needs to be read into the stories of the Old Testament. We have to differentiate between people in those stories and people in the time after the arrival of Jesus and his message. Now, you might object by saying that I doubt people were really as bad as orcs in the Old Testament. And yes, that's probably maybe just a little bit hyperbolic. But the context that the Bible establishes for us in creating a narrative of that whole story is that they were severely corrupt and that God treats them accordingly. But we don't have to adopt this necessarily as a historical view, because there are plenty of stories in the Old Testament, like, let's say, the book of Joshua, in which the Israelites mercilessly conquer the people inhabiting the promised land that they are entering into, that plenty of Orthodox theologians treat as something of a mixture of both history and legend. It's sort of like what the Iliad would be to the story of the Trojan War. There are actual historical events and people depicted there, but there are also legendary heroes and the gods punctuating and emphasizing the important lessons and the takeaways that the author wants for us. So no, you don't have to take a historical view that says humanity was once as bad as the orcs. But if you're going to treat those stories as analogies or legendary, you have to do the same with God's conduct as it's depicted there. You can't give a pass to the way that humanity is described, but then treat the way that God is described as a strictly literal and final representation of who he is. The important takeaway from the Old Testament and from these stories is that humanity was severely estranged from God, and that in order to help the human race align with what is good and what is true, he had to progressively and iteratively reveal himself and moral truth to them, starting with a very strict system of law and discipline, and then eventually getting to the fullest lesson and revelation in the person of Jesus. You could compare it to something like an education curriculum, like a grammar curriculum, in which the first lesson is very crude. They're singing the alphabet together just to get acquainted with the very basic concepts. But by their last lesson, they're writing rhetorical essays. If you place someone who has gone through that entire curriculum and all of that formation and sat them down again for that first lesson where they're just singing the alphabet, it would seem bizarre and inappropriate. But that's because after having gone through all of that formation, that lesson doesn't suit them anymore. Another analogy could be something like learning to drive a car. I remember when I went for my first in-car driving lesson, my instructor was a real taskmaster. He was after me for every infraction, making sure that I was constantly observing my speed and keeping my hands in the exact same position all the time, and shoulder checking like a dozen times before I even thought about changing lanes. And that's quite appropriate and necessary, because when you're learning to do something that in this case is quite dangerous, I would say that an excessive amount of vigilance and discipline is needed until you get the hang of it. I also remember that during the course of my training in the last lesson, he instructed me to drive through a Dairy Queen drive-through so that we could get some ice cream. And the reason we could take that more relaxed and leisurely approach is because I had become competent enough as a driver that we could all act differently because the circumstances had changed. And by the circumstances, I mean that I had changed. The instructor hadn't changed. He was the same guy from 2 weeks ago, but because I had changed, his interaction with me could change. And this is exactly what I think accounts for the difference between God in the Old Testament and the New Testament. It isn't that he changed, it's that humanity, which he had been forming, had changed through that formation, and he therefore could act differently with us. Jesus is the final lesson in God's revelation about himself and about ourselves. That revelation comes at the end of a very long sequence of him slowly revealing greater moral knowledge to his people and then eventually to the whole world. If you were to isolate one of those lessons and to extract it out of the context of the whole sequence, it might seem bizarre, arbitrary, and incompatible with the whole. But as part of the whole and an understanding where it leads, it actually makes perfect sense. Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we internet in Canada. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.